Good evening. Hello. Good evening. That's better. And welcome to the American Antiquarian Society for the 35th James Russell Wiggins Lecture in the History of the Book in American Culture. We're here in Worcester and in Antiquarian Hall with a robust audience watching also on YouTube. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain a vital presence here in central Massachusetts. Tonight's program is co-sponsored with the Bibliographical Society of America. We're also delighted to have in the audience our participants in the Rare Book School course being held at the American Antiquarian Society this week, African American Print Cultures in the 19th Century, taught by Derek Spires and Ben Fagan. The James Russell Wiggins Lecture is a signature event in the American Antiquarian Society's program in the history of the book in American culture. I'll say a few words about this program and the Wiggins Lecture, and then turn the program over to my colleague, John Garcia, to introduce tonight's speaker. The American Antiquarian Society's program in the history of the book has been a leader in this field of inquiry since the 1980s. Over 40 years, the program has sponsored summer seminars, lectures, including the ongoing Book Talks series that will resume virtually this fall, conferences and symposia, and the 5-volume A History of the Book in America, which was published between 1999 and 2010. The James Russell Wiggins Lecture has long been a highlight of this program, and we are pleased to relaunch it this evening after a 5-year hiatus. Over the decades, Wiggins lecturers have spoken about issues at the forefront of both the methodology and interpretation in the history of the book, and Wiggins lecturers have included many of the most eminent scholars working in the history of the book from the fields of history, literature, art history, and more. Previous Wiggins lecturers have included David Hall, the first Wiggins lecturer back 40 years ago in 1983, Kathy Davidson, Robert Gross, Carla Peterson, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Michael Winship, and Patricia Crane. This lecture honors James Russell Wiggins, who was a nearly lifelong newspaper editor, beginning as the editor of his high school newspaper, The Echo, in Luverne, Minnesota, in the early 20th century, and taking him from the Rock County Star, his hometown paper in Minnesota, to eventually the Washington Post, where he served as editor from 1947 until 1968. After a brief stint as the United States representative to the United Nations, he moved with his wife Mabel to Brooklyn, Maine, where they had purchased the weekly newspaper, the Ellsworth American. In what turned out not quite to be his retirement, he spent the next 30 years of his life, from his mid-60s into his mid-90s, as the editor of the Ellsworth American, raising its circulation from 3,000 to about 11,000, and writing all of its editorials and quite a bit of its occasional verse as well, even after he sold the paper in 1991. Russell Wiggins also served the American Antiquarian Society for many years. As the president of the American Antiquarian Society, that is the chair of our council, from 1970 until 1977. Those were momentous years when AAS began its fellowship program, when we got our first grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and much more. According to Marcus McCorison, in Russell Wiggins' obituary, Mark McCarson, by the way, led AAS from 1968 to 1992. Russell Wiggins, and this is from McCorison, was not unknown to break into a rousing rendition of Danny Boy at AAS annual meetings, claiming his Irish heritage authorized such nonsense. In recognition of his contributions to the society and his lifelong commitment to freedom of the press, his friends established the endowment to create the James Russell Wiggins Lecture, and tonight marks the 35th such event here at AAS. I'm delighted now to introduce my colleague, John Garcia, Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships at AAS, and previously an academic at Florida State University and a book dealer in New York, who directs the program in the history of the book in American culture. Dr. Garcia joined AAS a few months ago. He is leading our scholarly programs, and this week he is helping to coordinate our work with the Rare Book School. And so I'm delighted to introduce John now to introduce tonight's speaker, John Garcia.
Thanks, Scott, for that generous introduction. I still think I'm an academic, even though I'm an administrator most of the time. Thank you, everybody. Now it is my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's Wiggins lecturer. Richard Yarborough is professor of English and African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he has been teaching for over 40 years. In his distinguished career, Professor Yarborough has examined issues of race, representation, and American culture. And he has published important essays on authors such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Pauline Hopkins, Charles Chestnut, and Richard Wright. And also, one of my favorite parts of the CV, Jimi Hendrix and Prince. The Wiggins Lecture in the History of the Book in American Culture recognizes a scholar who has made significant contributions to book history, as Scott mentioned. But I want to point out that this also includes the field of scholarly editing. Professor Yarborough has led the way in making available lost or otherwise under-discussed text of African American authors. And it's a project that he has shared with contemporaries such as Nellie McKay, Nell Painter, Gabrielle Forman, Joycelyn Moody, Frances Smith Foster, Daphne Brooks, and Jacqueline Goldsby, to name just a few other luminaries in the field, all of whom have paved the way for important recovery projects to continue to this day. Dr. Yarborough served as Associate General Editor of the Heath Anthology of American Literature, and he was also on the editorial board of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. Both textbooks have surely shaped a generation of scholars and undergraduates. Some of us here may have been assigned these textbooks in your undergraduate career, or you may even have used them in your own teaching. But beyond this, Dr. Yarborough edited the Library of Black Literature, which he did for over 25 years. And more recently, with Frances Smith Foster in 2019, he co-edited an edition of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's a very significant record of achievement. His research has garnered many fellowships and awards, including the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of California President's Research Fellowship, and Stanford's Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. He's also been awarded many teaching awards. UCLA's Distinguished Teaching Award, 2 commendations from the City and County of Los Angeles, go LA, and the Darwin T. Turner Distinguished Scholar Award, and of course, in 2012, he was awarded the inaugural Richard A. Yarborough Mentoring Award from the American Studies Association. As Scott mentioned, we are very proud to host Rare Book School for the very first time here. And Professor Yarborough has been very generous in his time to visit us and to sit in on the course. And this morning, it was wonderful to hear him sharing his own experiences as a scholarly editor. That's just one of many examples of what a generous scholar that he is. Now, I want to end by quoting the editor's preface to Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl that was written by both Professor Yarborough and Frances Smith Foster. And they write about the editorial project, and I want to quote here. The richness of literary traditions comes from the continuing work of those who follow after and whose insights add to those of their forerunners. I think this is a perfect encapsulation of the labor of love that goes into scholarly editing. And it's just one of our speakers' gifts to us. We are so lucky to have Professor Yarborough today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Oops. Good start. There. They'll teach me to move things on the podium. Thank you so much for the generous introduction. I want to thank the American Antiquarian Society for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I'm very honored to have this opportunity. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and consideration that everyone involved has shown me thus far. Let me begin with a quotation. I was an orphan, and I was born in the state of North Carolina. The city was Wilmington. My mother died and left children. And of course, my father, bless him, scattered the children, and I couldn't remember many of my brothers and sisters because they were no longer there. A groundbreaking African-American opera singer, Caterina Jarboro, was the first Black woman to be featured with a predominantly white opera company in the United States. She was also my father's aunt and my great-aunt. This statement of hers that I read comes from the beginning of an interview that she did in 1972. What I find intriguing here is not just how, let's say, creative she's being with the facts of her biography, but also why she feels driven to present her background this way. Her remarks touch on a number of issues that I plan to engage this evening. First, there's Wilmington, North Carolina. Not only was Jarborough born and raised there, but she was born the year of the notorious Wilmington Riot, also known as the Wilmington Massacre or the Wilmington Coup. Second, her references to her father and to her siblings suggest both the significance of family connections for her and also the need she felt to establish her independence. Her father's role in what she says happened to her and her brothers and sisters is key. And John W. Yarborough, her father, is a crucial figure in the story, or perhaps better, the stories I will share with you. I should add that my presentation will reflect my experience as a scholar who witnessed during his career radical changes in how we conduct research and how we handle archives. Finally, my comments will touch on the way in which a scholarly project can change course unexpectedly. The serendipitous nature of archival research can be both exciting and dismaying in equal measure. Before diving in, I would offer two advisories. First, this is most definitely a work in progress, and you know what that means when the speaker says that. Second, I have way more information than I could possibly cover in the time that I have, so there are going to be a slew of loose ends and truncated plot lines. I think I did something. I'm not going to say anything more until the picture comes back. Did I hit something? I don't know.
I don't know if it's this or if it's that. Yeah, power might have went on that one, so let's give it a second.
Okay. All right. I should get a pointer to do that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let me start with saying a few things about Wilmington. At the end of the 19th century, Wilmington was the most important and the most populous city in North Carolina. In the wake of the Reconstruction in the South, we see the rise of the so-called fusion movement, which was driven by an uneasy alliance among African Americans, white Republicans, and members of the Populist Party. As a result of their success in the 1894 and 1896 elections, the fusionists held political sway in Wilmington, which led to African Americans occupying a number of highly visible public positions. And I would add that black voters outnumbered white voters in Wilmington, North Carolina. As occurred throughout the South, many whites were becoming increasingly resentful of African American political empowerment. Blatantly mobilized under the banner of white supremacy, an anti-black campaign quickly took hold throughout the state in advance of the 1898 elections. As historians have pointed out, the popular media played a crucial role in fomenting white fear and anger. This is an editorial that appeared in the Raleigh News and Observer by a very well-known white political cartoonist. And this is another one from the same newspaper. It's just tip of the iceberg. These are two examples of the messaging about the alleged threat that African Americans constituted in the South. Such visuals were part of the widespread and exceedingly effective propagation of a narrative of white victimization that energized Southern whites who felt marginalized in the face of black political power. In Wilmington, the white press particularly targeted a man named Alexander Manley, the editor of the Black Daily Record, local newspaper. Manley's problem stemmed from his having responded too bluntly to a controversial speech delivered the prior year by a prominent white Southerner named Rebecca Felton. Felton advocated the lynching of black men in the interest of safeguarding white womanhood in the region. And Manley dared suggest that there might actually be consensual relations between black men and white women. His argument was not well received in the white community. Election day was November 8th, 1898. And it was hardly surprising that the Democrats emerged victorious, particularly given the widespread intimidation of black voters. You could lose your job if you registered to vote. However, rather than waiting for the orderly transfer of power, white leaders upped the ante in their attack on blacks in Wilmington by demanding that Manley be forced to leave the city. Despite a meeting between white leaders and a cluster of prominent African Americans, the die was cast. On November 10th, a large group of armed whites marched to the office of the Daily Record in Wilmington and set it on fire. The Wilmington Riot had begun. The newspaper clipping is from a New York paper. So this was not an event that did not receive attention in the mainstream media across the country. And the picture on the right lower corner is a very oft reproduced picture of the whites armed in front of the building that had held the the Daily Record, and you can see it was burned. You can't see them, but the fire company, there had been a black fire company, and the black firemen are on the second floor. This is another picture, different angle of the burned building and a group of the armed whites on the right. There was a massive mobilization of both local militia, but also the widespread distribution of arms. Machine guns were actually imported for the occasion and put on display to intimidate the black community. Shift gears a little bit. When I was in graduate school in the 1970s, my dissertation centered on African American fiction published before World War I. Two of the most intriguing novels that I encountered were Charles Chestnut's The Marrow of Tradition, 1901, and David Bryant Fulton's Hanover, or The Persecution of the Lonely, 1900. Both novels dramatized the 1898 racist attack on the African American community in Wilmington. Although Chestnut had spent his formative years elsewhere in North Carolina, he had numerous personal connections with folks in Wilmington. Fulton, who wrote under the pseudonym Jack Thorne, actually lived for a while in Wilmington before moving north. Chestnut and Fulton were deeply invested in contesting the narrative advanced by white Southerners who argued that African Americans were responsible for the crisis. In other words, they brought their own victimization on themselves. Now, in the course of my immersion in African American history in graduate school, I also began to come across references to Caterina Jarboro. A particularly notable example was Langston Hughes's comment in his autobiography, The Big C, where he talks about the popularity of the black musical Shuffle Along in the early 1920s. Hughes writes, quote, Caterina Jarboro, now a European prima donna, and the internationally celebrated Josephine Baker were merely in the chorus. Everybody was in the audience, including me. Apparently, Hughes went to see it over and over and over again. Written by U.B. Blake and Noble Sissel, Shuffle Along was an unprecedented Broadway phenomenon and featured, in addition to Caterina Jarboro and Josephine Baker, Florence Mills, Ethel Waters, and Freddie Washington. After learning of my great-aunt's involvement in Shuffle Along, I began looking for every photograph I could find of Shuffle Along performers, hoping that I might be able to somehow identify my father's aunt in one of these pictures. And I have imagined that I have seen her, but I don't think I have. And in fact, I've read an interview where she says that she was forced to perform from the wings because she wasn't light enough. That may well have been true. Again, as you can tell, I'm suggesting that we take some of the comments that my great aunt says about herself with a grain of salt. Here's another image of the chorus women in Shuffle Along. What made all of this so affecting was the fact that Caterina Jarboro was a memorable, if intermittent, presence in my life when I was growing up. I can recall my father's touting her musical accomplishments and her worldwide travels. Aunt Katrina hardly, and I'm going to shift between Aunt Catherine and Aunt Katrina because we shifted between Aunt Catherine and Aunt Katrina. Aunt Katrina hardly needed his advocacy, however, for she was fully capable of blowing her own horn. As a child, I remember the panic that would be unleashed when we got the phone call from Aunt Catherine, letting us know on short notice that she'd be taking the train from New York City to Philadelphia, where we lived, and that she would be arriving within a few hours, and that she expected a warm welcome. To put it mildly, she was a force of nature. A tall woman with a huge voice and a gigantic personality to match, she was a striking combination of playful wit, highly dramatic theatricality, and intense pride. In true diva fashion, she did not hesitate to hold forth about her experiences in Europe or about the celebrities with whom she would hobnob on Sugar Hill in Harlem, or about how the younger black generation sadly did not appreciate her. In the middle of a conversation, she would shift into German. No one knew what she was saying, and then she would shift back in English, and then she would shift to Italian, and she would shift back to English. In contrast, as far as I can recall, she never discussed her childhood or her upbringing in Wilmington. It was as if she somehow exploded on the artistic scene fully formed, completely a product of her own imagination and talent. This impression I had was reinforced for me by the mysterious nature of her name. No one explained to me why her last name was Jarboro, but she was a member of our family, and we spelled our name differently. I will return to the issue of her silence around her childhood and upbringing later, but I just want to mark that for now. Over the past several decades, I have gathered a great deal of information about Aunt Katherine. Ironically, some of it came via a scrapbook that my father had kept, which one of my sisters took for safekeeping after his death in 2006. Oddly enough, despite his tremendous pride in Aunt Katherine, whom we would talk about all the time, it was only after his passing that I saw the pictures that I'm going to share, which are in the scrapbook. I show them because they're very rare, and most of the pictures we've seen of her come from after she had attained her celebrity. Miss Katherine Yarborough, and the caption says, "This is the first time a likeness of the charming Miss Yarborough has appeared in print since she has been carrying on her studies in Europe." After Shuffle Along, she was in another Broadway hit, Runnin' Wild. She was actually a named character. And then, through mechanisms that I'm still trying to figure out, she left New York City, went to Paris, no connections there, somehow began being trained as an opera singer, then went to Italy, where she established herself before coming back to the United States. This is a photograph from 1925 from Europe. And then this is, what you're seeing is a kind of time-lapse photography, like you see the flowers growing slowly. This is 1929. Note the spelling of her name, by the way, up to this point. There's still a great deal to unearth about her life from the time she left Wilmington, which varies in terms of the documentation, probably around 1916, 1917 or so, and her triumphant return to the United States, where she sang the lead in Aida, which was the go-to opera for black women. In 1933, in New York City at the Hippodrome Theater, which received, I didn't touch it. Might be short in the cord.
Let's just see if this one works. Okay, watch.
I got it. Thank you so much. Okay. There's still a great deal to unearth about her life from the time she left Wilmington to her triumphant performance in New York City in Aida. And she was with the Chicago Opera Company. That's, even though I'm not sure it was based in Chicago, it was the name adopted by the company. And her performance received considerable media attention. I gather that after one show, she received flowers from both Bill Robinson, Bojangles, and Paul Robeson. So we're talking about some rarefied air. And she would have said she fully deserved that kind of attention. You'll note the name, by the way. She is now transformed from Katherine Yarborough into Caterina Jarboro. And I'm going to go back and forth between Caterina Yarborough and Caterina Jarboro, but the J is part of, it would have been pronounced as a Y sound, which is why it was transformed in Europe. And she kept it, but of course, once she came back to the United States, people began pronouncing the J as a J. So I will go back and forth. And I would add that such name changes were not unusual for black opera performers at all. In fact, black performers generally. It was very common practice to recreate yourself. In the midst of gathering information about her, I began to encounter hints of a quite unexpected intersection between my literary research with my investigations into Jarborough's life. An especially striking moment occurred when at the Schomburg in New York City in the 1980s, I came across a poem dedicated to Caterina Jarboro by David Bryant Fulton, the author of one of the novels that I mentioned. At times, I found it exceedingly difficult to digest the fact that this extraordinary performer who received such adulation was my great aunt, the woman who could talk over anybody, who cheated at pinochle, and the woman who attended my high school graduation. I'm the depressed-looking person in the middle. And that is her nephew, my father, John W. Yarborough III, next to me, and to give the other side of my family props. It's my mother and two sisters, and John W. Yarborough III, and a depressed-looking speaker in the middle. These were difficult times. I guarantee you that Aunt Catherine was the only person in attendance who's shown up in a mink. By the time I joined the faculty at UCLA in 1979, I'd begun thinking of conducting an oral history with Aunt Catherine, who was still alive at that time. Indeed, we spoke by phone about the possibility. Unfortunately, she passed away before we could embark upon that project. A missed opportunity that haunts me even today. The intersecting lines of inquiry that I've been describing came into sharper relief during my first trip to North Carolina in the mid-1980s. My main goal was to conduct research for an article that I was writing about the novels by Chestnut and Fulton about the Wilmington Riot. By then, I'd learned that the house in Wilmington, owned by John Yarborough, was still there. And in fact, it was acknowledged as an important historical site in the city. You can barely see it there, but this is a plaque on the house. What was clear was that despite the fact that Caterina Jarboro left Wilmington relatively early in life, and in fact had to leave Wilmington to achieve what she did, the city remained an important touchstone for her. I later learned that the year before her high-profile appearance in Aida in New York City in 1933, she'd performed in Wilmington. She'd come back to the US and performed in Wilmington in 1932. One of the performances was a recital for townspeople impoverished during the Depression. The final image of Caterina Jarboro that I will share is from a celebratory event in her honor that took place late in her life. And I should add, that's a very characteristic gesture. Now, in addition to visiting the Yarborough house on that research trip in the 1980s, I went to the New Hanover County Public Library in Wilmington to examine issues of the Wilmington Messenger, the newspaper, one of the main white newspapers in the city, published in the days leading up to the 1898 riot. And again, I'm looking for background for the piece I'm working on regarding Chestnut and Fulton. This was long before digitization, so I ended up sitting in the library, ordering reels of microfilm, poorly reproduced images on these reels, and just skimming issue after issue of the newspaper. Having looked at the issues leading up to the riot, and then those that covered the riot on a hunch, I had a couple of hours left, I decided to keep looking at issues after the riot, see what the fallout was. And this caught my eye. It's an article that describes the convening of the coroner's inquest committee to investigate the violence. Now, my assumption is that such a group would consist exclusively of white members of the community. Imagine my shock when I saw the name John W. Yarborough at the end of the list of 6 committee members. Now, I've since learned that the name before his, Elijah Lane was also an African-American member of the Wilmington community. And by the way, complicating things, I believe the coroner was black because he had been put in the office when the fusionists had been running the city. Think about the dynamics of a black coroner being asked to investigate the bodies of black victims of the white violence. This unexpected collision between my family history and the story of the 1898 Wilmington Riot was, to put it mildly, disorienting, and it raised myriad new questions. What was John Yarborough's position in the local black community? What were his relationships with leading whites in the city? This is not a good reproduction at all. I apologize. It's a map of a portion of the Wilmington area where my ancestor's house was. That is 214 Church Street. That's where that house is located. And I had set this up so that I could track his barber shop. He was a barber, and he had his shop for years, although it shifted location a couple times, there on Front Street. What I'm interested in is right about there, roughly, is where the Daily Record office was that was burned. I want you to see proximity. It's at least the same distance from where the Yarborough house was as where he worked, maybe even closer. I'm not quite sure of scale here. It was roughly about 6 blocks away from his family's house. What had to be going through the minds of John and Annie Eliza Yarborough, his wife, when the city exploded in violence? Could they hear the white mob 6 blocks away? Could they see the smoke from the burning building? What conversations were taking place in the Yarborough house during that terrifying time? They had 3 children in the house with them at the time, 4. 3 of them, ages 2, 7, and 10, and then a relative newborn, who was Caterina Jarboro. Of particular interest to me, how were the lives of John and Annie Eliza Yarborough and their children different in the wake of the riot? Many blacks were driven from the city, many blacks left, they stayed and picked their lives back up after the violence. What impact did the events of November 1898 have on Aunt Caterina and her siblings? As I mentioned, I do not recall Aunt Catherine's ever discussing her childhood, but what about her brothers and sisters? This is John W. Yarborough II, Jr., and Caterina's brother. He's my paternal grandfather. He died before I was born. I had no contact with him. However, 2 other of Aunt Catherine's siblings were quite long-lived, into their 90s, near 100, and I got to know them personally. This is one of Aunt Catherine's sisters. Born in 1896, Anna Eliza Gale was Caterina's older sister. While Caterina was in Europe in the 1920s, establishing herself in the world of opera, Anna Eliza had moved to New York City and was becoming an important figure in the African-American community. She actually got involved in New York City politics through her husband, who was a real estate person. When he passed away, she took over his political role. She was very proud of being nearly 100 and working with what she called the old folks' home, where people were 70 and 80 years old in Florida. Despite Aunt Caterina's, if you remember that opening quotation where she says the brothers and sisters are scattered, despite Aunt Caterina's suggestion that she and her siblings did not have regular contact, I have learned that Aunt Eliza and Aunt Catherine were actually in close touch during the 1920s. In my interactions with Aunt Eliza, you won't be surprised, I can recall no reference to Wilmington, to her childhood, to her upbringing. The sibling, and this is a picture of my father and Aunt Eliza in Florida during a visit. The sibling I got to know best was Joseph Yarborough. Born in 1903, Aunt Katrina's younger brother, he lived into his 90s, and because he resided in Philadelphia, he and my father spent considerable time together, particularly after the death of his wife, Uncle Joe's wife, and my parents' divorce in the 1980s. On a couple of occasions when I was in the area visiting my father, I would talk to Uncle Joe. And on a couple of occasions, I very tactfully sought to talk to him about his early life and what he remembered in particular about his father. I did not lead with, what do you think of the Wilmington Riot? I just want to get more information about his father. On the one hand, he did share some insights about family background. On the other hand, Uncle Joe was fully capable of suddenly developing difficulty hearing or understanding certain questions. And he would have a blank look on his face, and I knew that I had hit a wall. There were clearly topics he was not going to discuss. What I had to confront was what one might call a major gap in the archive. In my remaining time, I want to identify several developments that have had a major impact in my ongoing research into the Wilmington Riot, Caterina Jarboro, and my paternal family line. The first of these developments is the increased attention paid to Afro-American artists who made their mark in the field of classical music, or what some would call European art music. In addition to the appearance of a growing number of scholarly and popular books on the topic, it's telling that Marian Anderson has been honored with the U.S. postage stamp. And then there's the recent film, Chevalier, about the 18th century French violin virtuoso. In 2018, I was invited to speak at a symposium in Wilmington in honor of Caterina Jarboro. And I have recently been contacted by a graduate student in Italy who is researching Caterina's career on the Italian stage. Something has changed. The tide has shifted, in particular with regard to overlooked and long forgotten Black artists in this arena. A second development also involves a growing body of information. There's an increasing number of historical studies of white attacks on Black communities, such as those that occurred in Wilmington in 1898, in Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, and in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Indeed, the memoir of Viola Ford Fletcher, a survivor of the Tulsa riot, has just recently been published. Current discussions of reparations are also part of these new conversations that I'm describing. The third development is the emergence of trauma studies, interdisciplinary, scholarly arena. Especially enlightening has been the work of scholars like Kathy Caruth and Marianne Hirsch. And you may know Hirsch's work through her use of the term post-memory. And people have written about, for example, Beloved by Toni Morrison, using the idea of post-memory and trauma. Also relevant on this front are popular books like The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk. The contributions of such thinkers enable an understanding of possible reasons for family silence around the Wilmington Riot that I mentioned earlier. All of these theorists talk about conscious and unconscious choices not to revisit the trauma through a conversation about the trauma. It's hardly surprising that the two scholars who interviewed survivors of the Wilmington violence similarly encountered an abiding reluctance to discuss the tragic and traumatizing events. Next, and this is related, I have found very valuable the work of Saidiya Hartman. In her book, Scenes of Subjection, as well as her influential article titled Venus in Two Acts, Hartman wrestles with how one is to come to an understanding of the experience of enslaved blacks in the face of monumental gaps in the archive. Her provocative recommendation is that we engage in what she terms, quote, critical fabulation, unquote. I would propose that this strategy can be a productive response to archival gaps when considering such traumatic events as the Wilmington Riot. Indeed, the fictive narratives by Charles Chestnut and David Fulton take on fresh significance when viewed from this theoretical perspective. Last but not least is the impact of the digitization of materials that previously were available only in special collections or via often barely legible microform. That such materials are now word searchable almost feels like cheating. And a side note, where were word processors when I was writing my dissertation? And no, I'm not bitter. On the one hand, I would suggest that something can be lost when examining archival material in the comfort of one's office versus sitting in a location where one has access to the secret knowledge of the librarian on site. Whatever you find about something online, the librarian knows more. On the other hand, the ability to scan scores of issues of a newspaper via targeted word searches is an undeniable boon if used with caution. Word searches do not always turn up every appearance of the term you're looking for. I'm sorry to say that, but it is true. Over the past year or so, I have thereby been able to fill in numerous gaps in the history of Aunt Caterina's family. In particular, I now have a richer, more complex sense of her father, John W. Yarborough. And let me give you just two examples. First, I've discovered that Yarborough had, in fact, served on coroner's inquest committees before the one convened in the wake of the riot in November 1898. And in hunting around online, I came across a reference to a black Civil War veteran named Matthew Campfield, who settled in Wyoming, where he worked as a barber, and where he was elected to serve as coroner in his predominantly white community. It cannot be coincidental that John W. Yarborough may have been the best-known black barber in Wilmington. There's something more to talk about and think about in terms of the perception, reality, or otherwise, of barbers, medical issues, damaged bodies. So there's something going on there because it was not a unique connection. I think what is more telling is that as an African American, he was playing that role both before the riot and after the riot. The second example involves John Yarborough's political stance at the time of the riot. What is now clear is just how deeply he was invested in the maintenance of peaceful race relations in the city, a position that had to have been informed by the fact that the clientele at his barbershop would have consisted of whites and most likely elite whites. You probably won't be surprised to know that barbershops were not integrated. If you cut black hair, you did not touch white people. His shop, which was one of the most prominent in the city, received frequent notice in white newspapers. I have no doubt that his clientele was white. Yarborough presents his views in September 1898 when he published an open letter to black ministers in a white Wilmington newspaper. And I don't think that's very legible. Just to read a section of this open letter. He's criticizing black ministers in Wilmington for expressing support for Alexander Manley, the black editor who was under attack. And this is a section from the middle of that, what's headed a card. It's basically an open letter. This is John W. Yarborough to the ministers, black ministers. He says, "You have, however, gone outside of your duties as Christian ministers and have stirred up strife among our own people and have tried to make them work against their own interests. You have done great harm to your congregations and their families, and your conduct may be the means of making paupers of some of your members. If you would give more of your time to the work of your churches and not go around stirring up prejudice among your people, you would be doing a greater work for them. You should be the last people to agitate the race feeling as you and all your congregations get their living from the white people." He continues. The fact that Yarborough placed this piece where he did in a white newspaper indicates that he was speaking as much to white Wilmington as he was to the black ministers. Roughly a month later, in that same newspaper, an article was published reprinting with sarcastic critical commentary a statement from, quote, "an organization of colored ladies." Now this piece, their statement, was another open letter. It had appeared in the Black Daily Record, and the white editor of the newspaper went into the Daily Record, pulled it, and reprinted it in the white newspaper with annotation. This open letter to black men from the Organization of Colored Ladies quite bluntly warns them that there will be consequences if they allow themselves to be cowed into not voting. There's a reference to how they will raise their daughters not to entertain the attentions of black men who don't stand up for themselves. There's a lot to say here. What's evident is that there was a heated difference of opinion in the Wilmington black community in the weeks and months leading up to the riot, and John W. Yarborough was directly involved in the debate. Coincidentally, the essay that I published on Chestnut and Fulton in the late 1990s focused on how Chestnut and Fulton dramatized the Wilmington Riot as constituting what might be described as a crisis of black masculinity. In Chestnut's marrow of tradition, the black men who stood up for themselves in armed self-defense were murdered. They were all killed. This is also the case in Fulton's novel. Any black man who picked up a gun to defend the community was killed. But Fulton depicts a remarkable black woman as the main embodiment of a type of heroism conventionally gendered male. The sharply contrasting public statements by John W. Yarborough and the group of black women manifests just how complicated questions of resistance, gender roles, and social class were in Afro-American communities under assault at that time. As I suggested at the outset, I cannot pretend to have a neat wrap-up. For every question for which I discovered an answer, a slew of new questions sprung up. It's like whack-a-mole. However, I now know a great deal more about Caterina Jarboro and the world and the family that produced her. I also have a much more nuanced and complex understanding of the exceedingly complex interracial and intraracial dynamics in communities like that of Wilmington. And sometimes when we think back of those communities under assault, I think sometimes we can fall into a too easy binary perception of the victimized black community and the white community that was monolithic in its assault. And my research has, if I didn't know it before, rendered such flat, unnuanced engagements with that particular reality as unacceptable. As I mentioned, there's much more to say, but let me stop here. Be happy to answer questions or avoid questions like Uncle Joe that you might have, but thank you for your attention. I very, very much appreciate it.
Hey. We have time for Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we can also take questions from our virtual audience as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Yarborough, for that very, very interesting look at your family history. And through that uncovering, I think, the complexity of Black politics in post-Reconstruction North Carolina. And I was just wondering about this, having just completed a book on Reconstruction and its aftermath. This debate that you uncovered through the newspapers, and I haven't seen that in the historical records, so that was really revealing and wonderful for me to hear, between John W. Yarborough and the Black ministers who are defending Manly, whether this is an echo, perhaps, of the debate going on among Black men, and you described it as, rightly, I think, as a crisis of masculinity in terms of political leadership, between, this is just in the aftermath of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech, and I'm wondering whether this debate at the local level reflects that national debate that is taking place between those that are advocating a sort of a more forthright stance against the rise of Jim Crow, and those who are advocating more accommodationist politics, at least in public, or whatever they may think or do in private.
Yes, excellent question, and yes. You probably won't be surprised that when Booker T. Washington weighed in on the Wilmington crisis, he said a very Booker T. Washington-ish thing, which was, we cannot afford to put ourselves in a position of arousing this kind of hostility. Yes, you also see it in the well-known difference in opinion in terms of political agitation, of course, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, but I would suggest it goes back a long way. Many of you know that Martin Delany, a Black nationalist writer, who was a collaborator with Frederick Douglass, they had a major debate over Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Douglass felt it was important to keep Stowe as an ally, and he advocated supporting the novel. And Delany was one of the Black people who basically said Uncle Tom is not an appropriate model for Black men, and there was a very heated debate. There were a number of people who weighed in the Black community, especially in the North, who basically said things like Wilmington won't happen so much if Black people get guns and start killing people. You could argue that I'm going to not put it in a sophisticated enough way, but it's easier to say that from a northern perspective than it is when you're in the belly of the beast. But it is still an important question that needs to be engaged. And of course, it continues up through the 1950s and 1960s. So I guess what you're identifying is a consistent, complicated, probably unreconcilable through line with regard to the appropriate response to racist violence. And there's no easy answer, but it does erupt very powerfully in a wide range of literary and political circles at these crucial nodes of intense racism.
We have a question from online.
Yep, thank you, John. So Richard Saunders asks, you rightly point to silences in the archive regarding Black Americans. In my own work, I was reminded that Black culture was heavily oral. What role does memory and oral history play?
Yeah, I mean, that's really one of the things I'm suggesting with regard, and I really want to be humble in the face of overly broad claims. I can only speak for my own memory and my own experience, and I should say that as a child, there were going to be certain conversations that were going to take place when I'm not there. So all I can say is what the most telling example is probably Uncle Joe, because we were adults at that point. But I don't want to pretend that I'm privy to other conversations. But one of the things I guess I'm getting at is that the gap in the archive is a gap in the oral archive of the storytelling that some families do pass on through generations. And ironically, I have been trying to use print archives in some ways to maybe like a silhouette, you work from the outside in, trying to gain access, maybe critical fabulation, Saidia Hartman's suggestion, where I would have thought or hoped, even though I understand why it wasn't there, that there might have been some oral passing on of stories. For what it's worth, there's an interesting contrasting but similarly complicated dynamic among white Wilmingtonians in terms of what the children get told about the events of that time period. So the whole question of oral versus written archive is sort of a little bit turned on its head in my engagement, because I was looking for oral archives first. And absent that, then I had to turn to other materials.
Thank you so much, Richard. Two things that seem to really stand out in what you shared. One is how the Tulsa riot has perhaps unearthed so much other information that we have overlooked or has not been accessed. And I wanted to mention one, the Wilmington Riot in Texas. But the other issue is how complicated it is even when we do that. So that the one narrative, one point of view, both on the black and white sides. So just as this story, fiction life, history is life, reality is life, doesn't seem to make itself into more works of fiction, not so far as we can tell. And you'll have to come over to our collection and look at the rest of those novels in the period and see where else this has surfaced. The complexity of the experiences people are having, however, is what it seems to be problematic, and I want to add another wrinkle to it. The Wilmington Riot, nobody talked about it. It's the biggest riot in Texas. If you think about Tulsa, this was also a community, an all-black community, very much like Black Wall Street. Prairie View University and HBCU preserved the writings, the documents, the papers. Texas A&M at some point acquired the collection, but neither of those places gave attention to bringing it to the public. So I want to add that interesting wrinkle to our understanding of archives, the silent archives, the shifting archives, the ownership of archives, and why this needs to be more fully explored and understood. So I'm just kind of asking how you see that preservation issue and who tells the story, how do we protect or understand the nature of the complexity and not try to make it an either-or situation. So I know that was a lot, but yeah. I could have gotten it out better, but I know you get my point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. One of the things that it's not frustrating, it's just a reality, is that we are nowhere near a point in our history where the interests are no longer vested in the controversial nature of these events and therefore the controversial nature of any scholarship or historical engagement with these events. To give you an example, in 1998, there was a 100-year anniversary of the Wilmington Riot. There were a number of events in Wilmington. A commission was put together involving stakeholders, quote unquote, from every part of Wilmington. The commission almost blew up. 100 years later, there's still tremendous anxiety and controversy around engaging in what you would think would be a relatively straightforward historical exercise. That renders a level of anxiety, sometimes institutionally, sometimes personally, that leads to the kinds of silence or the lack of attention that you're describing with regard to institutions on both sides of the color line. 100 years is, I mean, if you can't do it after 100 years, what are we looking at? So I guess the challenge is that, this project for me is obviously, I mentioned it in passing, is obviously fraught from a personal standpoint. I mean, I'm downstream, at least on my father's side, from trauma. And I have been thinking about how I am a product to some way, not just from, of course, also my mother's side, but I'm downstream of that. And a lot of work has been done on generational, transgenerational trauma of various kinds. But that's an individual story. Communities are also downstream and have not resolved the problematic nature of those historical controversies sufficiently in order to have a mature engagement with the archive. And what you're describing is the archives are disappearing or they're being ignored while we're waiting for that maturing process to take place. And you're catching me on a cynical day. I'm not really hopeful, right, currently, that we're any closer to having the kind of conversation around race and racial violence and history that would enable a fuller engagement with materials, as you point out, that are there in many cases. They're just too dangerous in some ways. So we've got a lot of work to do. And I guess I'm also suggesting it's operating both at an affective personal level, but also at a scholarly institutional level, and also in a broader political national community level.
I think we have time for one more question from online.
All right, so Sandy Zagarel asks, thank you for a powerful and informative talk. Have you been able to determine your great-grandfather's standing among African Americans before and after the riot?
It's a good question, and when I mentioned I had too much material, it especially applies to what I found out about John W. Yarborough. He was a leader in the Black Baptist Church in the community. He was not a marginalized figure in the black community. In fact, one of the ironies is, and there's an interesting book about black barbers in the South, and black barbers often had white clientele, but they were often leading members of the black middle class. Now, having said that, he also obviously was involved in contention around charged political questions. But, and the other thing that I found interesting, because some historians have identified, I mentioned that the day after the election, whites convened a meeting with a cluster of prominent blacks. And they chose which blacks they were going to call. And basically they threatened. And they said, you need to do X, Y, and Z by tomorrow, or it's going to hit the fan. And it hit the fan. John W. Yarborough was not among the prominent African Americans they invited to that meeting, which is telling. I should also say that I have found a subsequent public statement that he put in the newspaper, in a white newspaper, complaining about certain trends he saw among black laborers, where they were not taking advantage of their opportunity. I mean, again, the kind of Booker T. Washington line. And in fact, there's evidence that there were people in the Wilmington community who had direct connections with Booker T. Washington, and John W. Yarborough was in that social circle. So this is not happening absent connections to the broader trends in terms of black political engagements. So I looked at a list of members of the Negro Business League that Booker T. Washington, I was hoping again to find maybe his name, and I didn't, but I didn't need to in some ways. He's not an isolated figure. He's not a free agent. There are broader political conversations in which he can be understood to be taking place in Wilmington and other parts of the South. And again, it even, complicates how we think of the influence of Booker T. Washington, for example. So he had high status in the black community, but I guess the point is that the black community was much more diverse. Just because there was maybe the talented 10th, it didn't mean that members of that level of the black elite were all on the same page. And also, affiliations shifted over time. There might be an occasion where there's collaboration and a shared engagement with a particular political question, and then there's another occasion where it doesn't happen. But he was not a marginal figure. He was not an isolated figure. He was not the only one who took those kinds of positions at the time.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Professor Richard Yarborough.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to echo John's thanks. Dr. Yarborough, that was magnificent. I love both the layers and what we learn about the method of doing a project like this through hearing about these different layers of the story that you're uncovering. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, both those who are here in person in Antiquarian Hall and those who are joining us on YouTube. For those who are here in person, we have a reception after the lecture across the street in the Goddard Daniels house. Please join us in the reception and an opportunity to talk further with Professor Yarborough. Next Tuesday evening, July 25th at 7 o'clock, we have another hybrid program, Emily Dickinson's Music Book, a live performance of an American poet's musical life, featuring George Bozowick, pianist Kit Young, and soprano Maria Ferrante. This is your chance to hear 19th century parlor music live. We have many other programs coming up this fall. Watch our website for those, and please do check out our YouTube site for past programs, and this program will be available on our YouTube site soon as well, so please recommend it to your colleagues and friends. And once again, thanks so much for joining us for the James Russell Wiggins Lecture at the American Antiquarian Society. Have a good evening.